This chapter deals with cost volume profit analysis. Cost volume profit analysis is a tool that helps managers make important business decisions. Basically, all it is the relationship between cost, volume, and profit or loss. We'll discuss how we use CVP analysis to figure out our break-even point, and also use CVP analysis to figure out how a company could earn a desired profit level. CVP analysis relies on the interdependency of 5 components. The components of CVP analysis are sales price per unit, volume sold, variable cost per unit, fixed cost, and operating income. And what we're also going to use is our contribution margin income statement, which has all these pieces put in together. When we use CVP analysis, we have to make some assumptions, and these are the 5 assumptions that we make. Assumption number 1 is that we assume we do not offer any volume discounts. We also expect that costs are linear throughout our relevant range. We also expect revenues to be linear in the relevant range. We expect our inventory levels will not change, and neither will the sales mix. And we'll talk about sales mix a little later on. The first thing we're going to do is calculate the unit contribution margin and the contribution margin ratio. To do this, we're going to use this particular example, and we're going to continue with this example throughout all the ratios, different ratios, and different formulas in this book. So be sure to pause the video and read the question and note down the relevant data. Let's take a look at what they tell us. They tell us that each poster currently sells for $35. So that is the selling price per unit. And each poster has a variable cost of $21, so that's $21 per unit. This business has fixed costs of $7,000, and the current selling volume is 550 posters. So volume is 550 posters. I want you guys to pause this video and prepare a contribution margin income statement using this data. So pause the video and prepare a contribution margin income statement at a volume of 550 posters, and then we'll talk about the answer next. Okay, so I hope you all prepared a contribution margin income statement so you can check your numbers. The first number we have is, of course, always sales revenue. Sales revenue was $35 per poster times 550 posters. That will give you $19,250 as your sales revenue. We know that our variable cost was $21 a poster, so variable expenses end up being $21 times 550, which is $11,550. And you know that in our contribution margin income statement, we subtract variable expenses from our sales revenue. The difference is our contribution margin, and our contribution margin is $7,700. From that contribution margin, we subtract our fixed cost. Fixed cost for $7,000, and that will give us our operating income of $700. This is a recap from our last chapter, so everybody should be comfortable with this by now. Whenever we do CVP analysis, we calculate unit contribution margin and several other numbers, but the first thing that I'm going to introduce you to is unit contribution margin. Unit contribution margin is equal to sales price per unit minus variable cost per unit. Contribution margin per unit is used to forecast operating income at different levels of volume within the relevant range. Now pause your video and calculate the contribution margin per unit from our previous question. You should have come up with a contribution margin per unit of $14. Your sales price was $35, variable cost per unit was $21, and you subtract 21 from 35, giving you $14, which is your contribution margin per unit. Now, how do we use this to forecast operating income at different volumes? Let's say you know that our current sales volume was 550 units. Let's say we want to find out how much is our sales if we sold 650 units. Instead of going through our entire contribution margin income statement, you can just take your contribution margin per unit, which is 14, multiply that by 650 to come up with their contribution margin for 650 units, which will give you 9,100. Then you subtract your fixed cost of 7,000 because you know fixed cost doesn't change with changes in volume. And then you figure out that your operating income at 650 units would be 2,100. So you can quickly forecast using these three steps, what your operating income will be if your sales volume increases to 650 units. The next thing we're going to talk about is a contribution margin ratio. Again, this is another formula for you to write down on those index cards and bring to class. The contribution margin ratio can be calculated in two ways. They both end up with the same answer, and I'll explain why. So the contribution margin ratio is equal to unit contribution margin divided by sales price per unit. Or you could say contribution margin ratio is equal to contribution margin divided by sales revenue. Why does these two different formulas give the same number? It's because all you're doing is, if you take your first formula, this particular formula here, all you're doing is multiplying the numerator and the denominator by your sales volume. When you multiply the numerator and denominator by your sales volume, you're going to come up with contribution margin divided by sales revenue. So that is why you have the same number no matter whether you use the top formula or the bottom formula. Now pause the video again and use your data from that question to calculate your contribution margin ratio using unit contribution margin divided by sales price. And then you can use your contribution margin income statement that you calculated to calculate your contribution margin ratio using contribution margin divided by sales revenue. Using your first formula, you get your unit contribution margin was $14, sales price per unit was $35, and you get a contribution margin ratio of 40%. If you use the second formula from your contribution margin income statement, your contribution margin was $7,700 and your sales revenue was $19,250, giving you again 40%.